Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started. My name is Adam Thomas, and I'm the Assistant Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions here at Princeton. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our lecture today, which we offer as part of our special initiative on freedom of thought, inquiry, and expression. For those who may not be familiar with us, the Madison Program is a program in the Department of Politics dedicated to exploring enduring questions of American constitutional law and Western political thought. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, please visit our website at jmp.princeton.edu or follow us on X. Just search Madison Program. On our website, you can sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to our podcast called Madison's Notes, learn more about our upcoming events, and access recordings of previous ones, which now go back 25 years. I would like to begin by recognizing Professor Greg Conti, co-director of the Madison Program's Initiative on Freedom of Thought, Inquiry, and Expression, who will in turn introduce Professor Kaufmann. Greg is Associate Professor of Politics at Princeton and works in the fields of political theory and intellectual history, especially on questions of liberalism, democracy, and representative government in Britain and France. His first book, Parliament, the Mirror of the Nation, Representation, Deliberation, and Democracy in Victorian Britain, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2019. He's recently edited a volume of Albert Venn Dicey's Writings on Democracy and the Referendum, also published by Cambridge, and is at work on a volume of John Stuart Mill's collected writings on representative government and democracy. Please join me in welcoming Professor Conti.
Well, great. That was more than you needed to hear about my life, since I'm not really doing anything here today. But anyway, it's a pleasure to introduce Professor Eric Kaufmann. Kaufmann is professor of politics at the University of Buckingham, where he directs the Center for Heterodox Social Science. He's a leading expert on and public commentator on questions surrounding the ideological and demographic change that we've all been living through, and I've been reading and listening to him for quite some time. He's the author of, among other works, the books The Third Awokening, which came out just last year, Whiteshift, Immigration, Populism, and the Future of White Majorities, Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth, The Rise and Fall of Anglo-America, and The Orange Order. And he has also written for a number of important public outlets like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Times of London, and so on. So I'll just get out of the way here and allow him to get going with today's lecture, Woke is Not Dead, The Future of Cancel Culture. So let's welcome Professor Kaufmann.
Great. Thank you, Greg. Thanks. It's great to be here. It's first time in Princeton, and really enjoyed it. Enjoyed walking around. Getting used to the weather, though, because it seems to jump about 20 degrees day to day. We're just used to gloom in the UK. Today I'm just here to talk to you about this question of the vibe shift and woke, this whole question of whether woke is a fashion, and I'll explain what I mean by woke in a minute. I think it is a useful concept that can be defined in a rigorous way. So without further ado, I'm going to go through a lot of data from the US, Canada, and Britain to try and figure out what's going on with regard to attitudes to free speech, what this means for the future, in particular of classical liberalism and free speech, and what the trends are telling us. So this is very much an empirical look. There will be a lot of slides, but I'm happy to go back to any slide at the end in the Q&A. I want to talk a little bit about this concept of woke and where it comes from, and I talk a lot about this in my book, The Third Awokening. The first thing to note is this is, I argue, perhaps in contrast to some others, such as Chris Rufo and James Lindsay, Francis Fukuyama, Yascha Mounk, who really see this ideology as a derivative of post-Marxism. I see it as really more an outgrowth of cultural left liberalism. So more of a sort of mainstream left liberalism. And that's left liberalism in culture. So it's where liberalism, egalitarianism, and humanitarianism overlap. I've also used the term left modernism for this. So this is very much about things which did a lot of good but have overreached, I would argue. But By the term woke, I have a one-sentence definition, which is the sacralization of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual minorities. That is woke in one sentence. Notice there's nothing there about vaccines, environment, government, all these other things which are sometimes lumped in with it, which I don't think should be. And so that's really to do with particular emotional attachments, affective attachments to particular groups who are symbolic. To use Musa al-Gharbi's term, they have totemic capital. They've been elevated and sacralized in the system. So it's attachment to particular symbols. But at the same time, we also have what we might call political philosophy, which I would refer to as cultural socialism. And that is really involving the two, what Jonathan Haidt would call the care, harm, and equality moral foundations. So it's about equal outcomes and emotional harm protection. That's the care harm aspect to this. And so that's cultural socialism. Now, the reason it's woke cultural socialism is because it's focused on equal outcomes and emotional harm protection for marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups. If we were talking about equality for people based on looks or athleticism or intelligence, if you think of the handicapper General Kurt Vonnegut's short story, that's focusing on those dimensions. That would not be woke cultural socialism, but it would still be cultural socialism because it's about making everyone equal regardless of their intelligence and redistributing on the basis of intelligence. So what I'm talking about here is this philosophy of woke cultural socialism, equal outcomes and emotional harm protection for historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups. So no race and gender gaps, for example, in desired outcomes on the one hand, and then also emotional harm protection for offensive speech. Now, in terms of tracking this over time, I do a lot of both big data and survey analysis in the book. And I argue that we've just been through the third cultural left liberal awakening. The first was in the late 1960s. Now, if you look, one way of tracking this is to look at mentions of the term racism and the term sexism in English language books on Google Ngram, and you can track this. You can see there's a rise in the frequency of the use of the term racism in the late 60s, and that's when we have the rise of the New Left and more of a discourse around racism. Then we come to the late 1980s, early 90s, political correctness, Eurocentrism, speech codes, that was all happening in the late 80s, early 90s. And then we come into what's currently called, what Matthew Iglesias would call the Great Awakening of the 2010s and early 2020s, where we see another surge. There's a couple of points to note. The first thing is that after each surge, it doesn't drop back to exactly where it was, but you see a kind of consolidation and then another spurt and then a consolidation. And I think that's important when we're thinking about the future of where we're going. I don't think we should be expecting this to drop to zero. The question is, how much consolidation is there? The other thing to note is that the third awakening is different from the first and second because I would argue the third awakening very much goes off campus. So if you were to look at mentions of racism in the New York Times or Washington Post in this time period, you don't see this pattern. It's pretty flat. There's very little mention, and then this surge in the 2010s in the third awakening, because these ideas from academia very much spill off the campus because of social media, because of the new opinionated clickbait media. They're spreading much more widely. And that's one of the reasons that the backlash as well to this is now involving, for example, federal politics in a way it didn't in the first two awakenings in the same way. It's now a political issue that decides elections. That wasn't the case during the first two awakenings, I would argue. I now want to come to this question of, is woke dead? Is it a passing fad? One of the reasons I would argue that it is not a passing fad and that we may be just in a retreat and consolidation phase is because these attitudes have very much taken hold amongst younger generations, particularly Gen Z. And I want to review a number of data sets that sort of ask survey questions about this generation. So here's a question from the American College Student Freedom, Progress, and Flourishing Survey of June 2024. If a professor says something that students find offensive, should that professor or class instructor be reported to the university? And in the survey, which is a large-scale survey, we see it's about, roughly 70-30, 71 to 29. Yes, that professor should be reported to the university if they say something the students find offensive, by 70 to 30. So quite a striking statement there, privileging arguably social justice values, that is, equality, equal outcomes, and emotional harm protection are a higher value than freedom of expression. Now, of course, we can always talk about what students are thinking about when they say the word offensive. That is an important methodological question. But still, the inclination here is towards protection and reporting. Now, there are a number of other surveys. We could look at many surveys, but just there's a series of questions, not all of which are exactly the same, but we can see a very strong and sharp age pattern in a number of questions. So, for example, that's not going to work. Sorry, just seeing if that now. No red dots, sorry. So, who do you support more, Israel or Hamas? This is from Harvard-Harris poll, December 2023. And the 18 to 24s break 50-50 between Hamas and Israel. This is a forced choice question. I appreciate that, and ideally we would have a number of other options. But that's just interesting that we see the 18 to 24 splitting 50-50, whereas if you look at the 65 plus, it's 96 to 4 for Israel. Again, that shows quite a sharp age gradation. And that question, I would argue, is very much linked to this second question, which taps into this idea of settler colonialism, which is closer to woke cultural socialism. So this question says, there's an ideology that white people are oppressors, non-white people and people of certain groups have been oppressed, and as a result should be favored today at universities and for employment. Do you support or oppose this ideology? Well, the U.S. public as a whole opposes it 2-1, but if you look at the 18 to 24s, they support it 80-20, and the 65 pluses oppose it 80-20. So just two other questions kind of showing this quite sharp age pattern. Here's some survey work I did in the UK and US in 2021 and 2022 on the Google programmer James Damore, who's the subject of this question. Damore was fired by Google because of a memo where he was exploring sex differences in desire to be in programming. Now, what's interesting is we find very similar results in the UK in blue and in the US in orange. So if you take the 18 to 25s, over 2/3 of them in both countries support this multinational corporation firing the young programmer, 68, 67%, whereas those over 55, it's sort of between 1/4 and 1/3. So over twice as likely if you're young to support firing James Damore on this question. And there's a very clear age pattern there as well. Another question, 2022 YouGov, which I fielded. Should J.K. Rowling be dropped by her publishers? So J.K. Rowling, as you know, has very gender-critical views on the trans question. And what we see here is, again, a very striking pattern. The 18 to 25s are splitting pretty much 50-50 between saying J.K. Rowling should be canceled or not be canceled by her publisher. Whereas anyone over 45, it's hardly anybody saying she should be dropped. Again, I think it fits in that age pattern that I just showed you on Damore. This young generation is therefore prioritizing those so-called social justice values. Again, equal outcomes, emotional harm protection for historically marginalized race, gender, sexual identity groups is a very high priority for them. Often trumps free speech, whereas it does not in the older age groups. Now, one of the things you might, one argument might be that there might be some kind of self-interested motive here explaining these patterns. But I would argue very strongly that this is a cultural belief and it is not actually motivated by personal experience. And so what this chart here, which also shows up in my book, comes from survey data in 2021 does, is it's got two data series. The first, what you see in that line there in orange is my fear of losing my job or reputation for something I might say or post online. That's the question that is denoted by that orange line. And what you can see there is that anybody under about age 45 has about a 45% chance of fearing that they will lose their job or reputation for something they have or will post online. So there's quite a high level of fear in that younger part of the workforce, including the 18 to 25s. Almost half of them are fearful that they might lose their job or reputation and get canceled. However, now older people are much less fearful of losing their job or reputation than young people, but old people are also less likely to agree to this statement. My fear of losing my job or reputation is a justified price to pay to protect historically disadvantaged groups. So if we take those 18 to 25s, a majority of them in this survey agreed with the statement that losing the job or reputation is a justified price to pay to protect these groups, even though they are highly fearful themselves of losing their job or reputation. So I would argue that this is not really about people being in favor of cancel culture when they aren't at any risk of being canceled. In fact, the people who are pro-cancel culture, a lot of them are very fearful of being canceled themselves, but they just buy into this belief system. I now want to move on to a couple of surveys of faculty, mainly in the U.S., not only in the U.S., but I want to show how, in fact, what's happening to those 18 to 25s isn't just isolated in a bubble of Gen Zers. Actually, there's an age pattern that characterizes the faculty as well, and we can already see new trends emerging in the survey data. This comes from a report I did with two researchers at Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, Nate Honeycutt and Sean Stevens, who've done excellent work. We used the FIRE's faculty survey 2022, asked a number of questions that have also been asked on the FIRE student surveys, these massive surveys that go out to about 55,000 students a year. So one of the questions has to do with approval or disapproval of shouting down a speaker during their talk to prevent them from speaking. Do you disapprove of that? Well, if you take faculty over age 55, 70% disapprove of shout downs of speakers. But faculty 35 and under, these are people who already have faculty positions, only 40%. So that's a big gap between those over 65 and those 35 and under, 40% versus 70%. Do you disapprove of blocking other students from attending a campus speech? It's 90% for those 46 and over, and it's only 60% for those 35 and under. Violence to stop a campus speech, basically 100% for the 55 and overs, and 80% for the under 35. So there's a significant gap by age within the faculty on a number of these standard FIRE free speech questions about shouting down, blocking, or using violence to prevent campus speech. And I think that's quite significant. I would say I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. The left-right, the ideological differences between young and older faculty are actually pretty modest. So these results cannot be accounted for by this idea of young faculty being more left-wing. They're actually not very much more left-wing. The gap is much more within that. There is less of a free speech orientation amongst younger faculty than amongst older faculty. And this more or less is going to reinforce the point you just saw in that survey, except it's a much wider range of studies. This covers Britain, the United States, and Canada. It covers both faculty and PhDs. And what is this? Okay, this comes from my report. There's a lot here. I will just explain you very quickly what this is. There were 5 hypothetical scenarios of if somebody in their research said, for example, that the British Empire did more good than harm, or said people raised in traditional families had better outcomes than those in non-traditional families, should they be encouraged to leave or forced out of their, not forced out, but just essentially encouraged to leave their position. And there were 5 scenarios, and faculty were asked if they approved of cancellation in any of these 5 scenarios. Generally, we had only about 10% of faculty approving of cancellation in most scenarios. What we see is the 55 and over faculty, it's between about a 0.10 and 0.15, 10 to 15% likelihood of being in favor of cancellation on at least one of those 5 hypothetical scenarios. Whereas the faculty 35 and under, whether in Canada or Britain or the United States, it's between 0.32 in Britain and 0.41 in Canada. The US is somewhere in between. So 0.32 to 0.41 versus 0.10 to 0.15, like over twice as likely to support canceling if you are 35 and under as opposed to 55 and over. That kind of chimes with what we just saw in the US results, and it also suggests this pattern holds not just in the United States, but also in Britain and Canada. It's worth saying, by the way, that for PhD students 35 and under, they are even more likely to support cancellation in the work that I did. 0.44 for Canadian PhDs and 0.56 for American. Those aren't huge sample sizes, but they're suggesting that there's a lot less tolerance for offensive speech and offensive research amongst young faculty and PhDs than amongst older faculty. And that is not because those young faculty are a lot more left-wing. In fact, the differences are not huge. So there's a new kind of left emerging in the faculty. And so that kind of gets me to this point about the differences between younger people on the left and older people on the left when it comes to the value of free speech and the importance of woke cultural socialism, or these social justice values, in trumping or superseding classical liberal values. And here I'm going to just look at go off the faculty and just look generally in the population. This is from the United States, 2021, some work I did. And the question here is about Mozilla CEO Brandon Ike, who was forced out. He supported Proposition 8 in California, which was the anti-gay marriage popular initiative. The question is whether he should have been forced out or not. And strong Democrats, what's interesting is if you take strong Democrats aged 18 to 35, the dark blue line, they have a 0.7 chance of agreeing that Ike should have been forced out, canceled from his position. Whereas if you take the 51 and over in the light blue line, it's only about 0.4. So there's about a 30-point difference between strong Democrats who are over 50 and strong Democrats that are 35 and under in their support for whether Ike should have been forced out. The gaps are much less amongst strong Republicans, where they're generally against forcing Ike out regardless of age. But both moderates and independents and Democrats, it's the young who are significantly more in favor of cancellation than the old. Similar kinds of results I find in a survey I did last year in Canada. This question really amalgamates three questions this index amalgamates three questions, one on whether J.K. Rowling should be dropped by her publisher, one on the cancellation of Frances Widdowson, an academic who's done controversial research on Indigenous people in Canada, and Kathleen Stock, a gender-critical feminist in Britain. The long and the short of it is that the red time series is really those who vote for left-of-center parties, the Liberals, the NDP, and the Greens. And you can see that that has quite a slope on it. And what that's telling us is that the young left is got almost a 1 in 2 chance of supporting canceling these three figures. The older left, less so. All right, so we've gone through a lot of data which would suggest that something important has happened within the left over time. Older people on the left are less likely to support cancel culture than younger people on the left. I want to go into more detail on some of the student surveys to ask about the importance of a number of different factors: ideology, sex, male and female, and sexual orientation, to ask what has changed over time. Because there are a number of theories for why we see a rise in intolerance for speech that is offensive over time. I'm drawing on April Blesk-Rishek's work at the University of Wisconsin using a very large sample survey of the University of Wisconsin student body. First question here asks, so what is the percentage of people who think those who express offensive views are causing harm to those they offend? So are people who express offensive views causing harm to those that they offend? And what you see, the first thing to note is people who are very liberal compared to conservatives are way more likely to agree that people who express offensive views are causing harm to those they offend. So that's 70% of very liberals versus sort of 12-13% of conservatives. And that's a sort of 50 to 60 point gap, an enormous difference based on your political beliefs. So political beliefs is clearly by far and away the most important factor. determining whether a student will agree with the statement that offensive views cause harm. But there are also some other demographics which are not strictly related to ideology. The first is there's a big gender gap. Female students are over twice as likely to agree with this statement as male students. And non-heterosexual students are almost twice as likely to agree with this compared to straight students, so 55 versus 31. Now, compared to the differences on sex and sexual orientation, racial differences are pretty small, actually, within 10 points. And it's the same situation on this second question, which is referring back to one of the first slides I showed you. Should students report an instructor who says something that students feel causes harm? Should students report an instructor who says something that students feel causes harm? 71% of very liberal students say yes, compared to 21% of slightly conservative and 13% or 14% of very conservative students. So that's a massive 50-point gap, mirroring that massive gap in the previous question. And likewise, we see women are twice as likely as men, 53 versus 27, twice as likely as men to agree with that statement. Non-heterosexuals are almost twice as likely as heterosexuals to agree with that statement. Racial differences, pretty minor. They're there, but they're pretty small. What do some of the more recent samples from the massive 55,000 a year FIRE student surveys tell us about, again, some of the drivers of support for aspects of cancel culture? In this case, support for shouting down a speaker. Is that okay? Yes, it is. If you are very liberal and you are LGBT, by which I mean non-heterosexual, sorry, the T is a bit of a misnomer there, but non-heterosexual students who are very liberal have almost a 6 in 10 chance of agreeing with the idea of shout downs. And very liberal students who are heterosexual, that's actually falls over 10 points to just above 0.4, maybe 0.45. So even if you are very liberal, it makes a difference whether you are not heterosexual or heterosexual. Heterosexual, very liberal students are less likely to support shoutdowns than non-heterosexual, very liberal students. The same holds, by the way, for conservative students. In fact, it holds even more so. If we take somewhat or very conservative heterosexual students in red and somewhat or very conservative non-heterosexual students in blue, there is as much as 20 points difference between those in support for shoutdown. So even conservative LGBT students have at least a 0.3 likelihood of supporting shouting down speakers. So sexual orientation really does matter. Now, this model also controls for other factors like age and race and sex and other things. Those are all taken account of. So this is independent of controlling for those other factors. Sexual orientation is a major factor in support for shouting down. Okay. By contrast, okay, there's been a lot written and talked about the mental health crisis among young people, not just teenagers, but also those in their 20s. On the FIRE surveys, we asked a bunch of questions about mental health to do with anxiety and depression and feeling lonely and a whole bunch of other questions. Not a whole bunch, 5 questions. One of the things that was surprising to me, I didn't expect, was that actually mental health status did not predict support for many aspects of cancel culture, or at least it had very little effect. And you can kind of see that here where, and it's worth saying, by the way, that a majority of students reported mental health problems, significant mental health problems, at least half the time. So this is a significant population. So the low anxiety and anxious half or more, that's almost 50-50 in terms of these student surveys. And what you can see is there's actually almost no difference between the red and the blue lines there. It's all the work's being done by ideology in terms of this question of supporting shoutdowns. If you're very liberal, you have a high chance or a higher chance of supporting shouting down speakers. And if you're conservative, you have a much lower chance, regardless of your mental health status. Now, that's quite different. If you go back to this graph, you look at the difference between those lines, it's a lot wider than that. And that's telling us that the LGBT sexual orientation really matters for views on shoutdowns. mental health status does not matter very much. So sexual orientation seems important, but mental health status does not. Now let's look at another question. Should a speaker who says that trans is a mental disorder be allowed to speak on campus? And that's a question that FIRE's been running for a number of years. The first thing to note is that somebody who is very liberal and is female, they have almost a 0.99 in 10 chance they say that speaker shouldn't be allowed on campus. The difference between men and women, the red is female, the blue is male, is significant. And it's partly because there's a ceiling effect. When you're getting up to 9 and 10, there's going to be less of a difference. You come down here, however, to look at conservative men and women. Conservative women are substantially more likely to say that speaker shouldn't be allowed on campus than conservative men by 20 points. That's a very significant gap. So even controlling for political beliefs, and we have other things in this model, including grade point average and socioeconomics and race and so on, even controlling for that, there's a big gender gap in terms of, well, we'll call it tolerance for free speech that offends. There's a 20-point gap, and that holds even for conservative students. I'll show you a number of other questions. It's not just questions that might offend liberals. So FIRE runs an equal number of questions that would offend conservatives. So a speaker who says the Second Amendment should be repealed so guns can be confiscated. Should that speaker be allowed on campus? Women are much less likely to want that speaker on campus. Somebody who says guns should be confiscated. And especially conservative women, sort of 0.4 to 0.5 likelihood of saying that speaker shouldn't be allowed on campus, sort of 10 to 15 points more than conservative men in blue. So sex really matters in terms of views on free speech. Same with this question. Structural racism maintains inequality by protecting white privilege. A speaker who says that, now of course the reality is that does get said on campus a lot, but leaving that aside, in the FIRE survey, a significant number of people said that speaker should not be allowed on campus, particularly conservatives, but particularly conservative women who are 10 points, 10 to 15 points more likely than conservative men to say that speaker should not be allowed to speak on campus. So the pattern by sex is not sensitive to the content of the speech necessarily. It's just that it's offensive speech. It could offend a conservative. It could offend a liberal. Either way, there is more resistance to allowing that kind of a speaker on campus by sex. Race makes almost no difference. Non-white versus white. Should we disallow a speaker who says Black Lives Matter is a hate group? The proportion saying that we shouldn't allow that person on campus doesn't differ much by race. And that kind of echoes what we saw in those University of Wisconsin results. Race doesn't seem to make much difference. Now, even if we break out strictly black students, yes, among black conservatives, there's a little bit more resistance than white conservatives, but it's not massive. And so that kind of brings us towards a first conclusion, which is, in terms of what predicts support for cancel culture. It seems as though ideology, where you are on a very liberal and very conservative scale, is by far the most important determinant or correlate for young people. Sexual orientation, straight versus non-heterosexual, matters a lot. Not as much as ideology, but it is significant. Gender, male versus female, matters for banning offensive speakers from campus, not for shoutdowns or blocking or violence. So women are not more likely to support that aspect of cancel culture, but they are more likely to support not allowing certain kinds of speaker to come on campus. Race doesn't seem to make much difference. And so what this tells us, perhaps if we're trying to track the changes on campus over time, is that so the campus has become more racially diverse. It's become more diverse by sexual orientation. The share of non-heterosexuals has about doubled in the last 10 years. And it's become somewhat more female, from 60-40 male-female in the 80s to about 40-60 today. Of those factors, what has made the difference? Now, my argument is actually that the increased racial diversity has probably had little to no effect. The increase in female share may have had an effect. Not necessarily a large effect, but it has had some effect. The increase in non-heterosexual may have had some effect as well. However, I still think the largest effect is around ideology. Not that students are a lot more left-wing, which they're not. They're somewhat more left-wing, but they're not that much more left-wing. It's more the content of what it means to be on the left and to be a liberal has changed towards identity and towards social justice and involves less toleration for offensive speech. I want to kind of continue to explore a number of facets of this. I mean, one of which is this youth gender gap, this emerging, what seems to be an emerging gender gap between men and women in political beliefs and in cultural attitudes among young people. This is from Gallup, looking at people aged 18 to 29 who identify as liberal by sex. And you can see that for men, it's pretty steady from 1998 at about 25%. For women, it really only starts to diverge in the 2010s, and by the time we get to the 2020s, women are at 45% liberal versus 25% for men. So that's one aspect of this in the United States. It's not just the United States, however. The U.S. is circled there. There is a big youth gender gap. This is looking at 18 to 29s and what share are liberal versus conservative. That pattern we see also in South Korea, in Germany, in the UK, and in Canada, where I'm from, and there's an election going on right now, and all of the polling that we have seen in Canada shows that young females are twice as likely to vote for a left-wing party as young men. So that pattern seems to be fairly consistent across many countries in the world, and I would argue that it's rooted in cultural attitudes more than in any kind of economic self-interest or other kinds of conditions. So we take this question from the UK, and this is from the YouGov Profiles data set, which is absolutely massive. There's about 5,000 people surveyed for every one of those ages, individual ages. The question is, thinking about political correctness, are you in favor of it because it protects against discrimination or against it because it stifles freedom of speech? And women are sort of between 30 and 40 points more likely to support political correctness than to oppose it. And men in blue are sort of between 0 and 20 points, about 10 points on average more likely to oppose political correctness. That's quite a large gap in views on political correctness. It reflects, I think, a lot of what we saw in those fire surveys, that young women have more of an orientation to be protected from speech, or not themselves, but historically marginalized groups should be protected from speech. But not only historically marginalized groups, even conservatives should be protected from harmful speech. Does that mean, however, that young men are really moving right and are really kind of taking a very different path from young women? I would say that can be exaggerated. And I just want you to look at this. I'm breaking down this question of should J.K. Rowling be dropped by her publishers by age and sex. Yes, it's the case that young men in blue, if you take the leftmost set of bars, slightly over 20% of young men say J.K. Rowling should be dropped by her publishers. Almost 40% of young women, however, say she should be dropped by her publisher for her gender-critical views. So that's definitely a larger gender gap than we see in the older age groups. However, I think it is also worth saying, even if we take young men aged 18 to 25, over 20% of them want to drop J.K. Rowling. And actually, if you take women 26 and over, they are significantly less likely to want to drop J.K. Rowling than young men. So young men are still more woke than women over the age of 25. So even though young men are a lot less woke than young women, they are still comparatively more woke than older generations. And I think we need to bear that in mind. Does not mean that young men are going massively to the right and are becoming massively anti-woke. So the result of all of this sort of age analysis is to make the case that woke is certainly not dead, and that cohort change, generational turnover, is going to mean that the 20-somethings of today in 20 years are going to be the 40-somethings. They'll be the median voter, the median corporate leader, organizational leader. I think there's still a strong case to be made that will change the culture in a direction away from free speech towards social justice values as a result of older generations who are more free speech oriented dying out, younger generations who are less free speech oriented replacing them in the population. There's been work on the General Social Survey has been asking similar sets of questions since the early 70s. And so we can start to look at generation as opposed to age. There's been interesting work by Dennis Chong, Jack Citron, and Morris Levy in California on some of these questions. So one set of questions in the GSS asks about should certain speakers be allowed to speak in public? Leftists, militarists, homosexuals, communists, and one of them is racists. Should these people be allowed to speak in public? And then what we have along the bottom is when people were born. So 1900, people born in 1900, in the 1972 GSS would have been in their 70s. They didn't want any of these people speaking, not leftists, not racists, not militarists, nobody. They were generally not very tolerant of a lot of these kinds of speech. But the toleration really starts to rise with generations as we move towards the baby boomers in the 1950s and early 60s. You can see a more tolerant orientation, not only to militarists and leftists and gays and communists, but also to racists. There's toleration for all of these groups rising over time until we get to about the cohort born 1950, the baby boomers. And what happens then is toleration for one of those six groups, the racists, starts to deviate from the other five groups. And that seems to accelerate, particularly as we get towards the millennials and Zoomers born kind of towards 2000. There's something about the identity categories around race, sex, sexual orientation that have become elevated, politically important, sacralized. And in a way, this is, I think, quite important, and it's an important point that represents a shift. And in fact, younger and better educated people are more likely to not want such a person speaking. That's an important trend. It's worth saying, however, that trend doesn't begin with the Zoomers or the millennials. It actually begins with the boomers. It's just that it's perhaps accelerated a little recently. Part of the point here is that the culture is changing, particularly the front edge, the most avant-garde part of the culture is changing. This is work from Adam Bonica on donations by professions. Now, those who make donations of $200 or more are recorded, and so we have information, and that's only about 1.5% of the population, but still, it's an interesting indicator that Bonica has looked at, and what you can see is that almost every profession is trending to the blue Democrat column over time in terms of the professions. So they almost all favor the Democrats, including engineers, tech workers, physicians. Some of these professions which used to be more Republican are all moving towards the Democrats. One of the reasons for that is arguably because cultural values have become more important for determining political beliefs. And as there has been greater support for cultural left liberalism, that has made a lot of these professionals move to the left. We can see there's an interesting question here, right? I mean, why is it the case that all these professions are moving to the left? Not just academics, but also doctors and lawyers, even engineers and tech workers. Why are they moving to the left over time? And one way I sort of tried to get at this was to look at support for political correctness by age and education level. And this is coming from the YouGov Profiles data set, which has about 1,000 academics on it. And so we can look at academics separately. That's the black line. The thing about academics is 70 to 80% of them support political correctness, regardless of age. So they're the under 39s, 40 to 50, 60 plus. Now that's, of course, you might say that contradicts what I said about, older academics being more tolerant than younger academics, but this is a question that's pretty broad. It just asks about support for political correctness. So it doesn't seem to vary much with age amongst academics. But if we take non-academics who have PhDs, these might be research scientists outside of academia. Those who are 60 and over are actually much more opposed. So PhD holders over the age of 60, most of them oppose political correctness. So education is not on its own enough to make you support political correctness, even advanced education. Whereas the young PhD holders, even those who are not academics, are very pro-PC. So, and the other group that's very pro-PC are left-wing activists who are online a lot. So it seems like there are a number of sources of this very sort of modern social justice culture. There's online activist circles, there's academia, and there's youth culture. And I would argue that these are all the front edge of this modern culture. So if you're closer to the sources of that modern left liberal culture, you're going to be more likely to support political correctness. It's not just having a PhD. That doesn't make you woke or politically correct. There are a number of other socialization mechanisms I want to talk about that may be new and emerging, and one is K-12, the school system, which is quite important, I would argue. One of the studies that I did with Zach Goldberg is that we did a survey of 1,500 18 to 20-year-olds. We asked them about a number of critical race theory concepts, and we can debate what that term critical race theory means, but the question was, have you in your school heard from a teacher or an adult a term such as white privilege, systemic racism, unconscious bias, these kinds of terms? We had 5 of these concepts, and we asked people how many they'd heard. Now, if you take these young 18 to 20-year-olds who'd heard the maximum of 5 concepts and you compare them to those who heard no critical race theory concepts, and then you looked at their support for a number of statements, you could see that those exposed to more critical race theory concepts were substantially more what we would call woke than those who had no such exposure. So here a statement: white Americans are ultimately responsible for the inferior position of black people. 80% of those exposed to 5 critical race theory concepts agreed with that statement versus under 40% of those who had not been exposed to those concepts. We're controlling for a lot of things in the data. We've got zip code level, county level, vote shares. We have what your parents voted. We have a whole bunch of things. Similarly, favor preferential hiring and promotion of black people. Roughly 45% of those exposed to all 5 critical race theory concepts support that, 20% of those who don't. So there's a substantial difference between young people who were exposed to a lot of critical social justice concepts in school and those who were not. This appears to be an important influence on their views. So schooling is an important factor, I would argue. It doesn't seem to matter whether you attended private school, public school, or even, by the way, homeschool. As long as you were exposed to these concepts, it seems highly correlated with your views. It's also correlated with partisanship. And I'm going to compare 2 sets of young people 18 to 20 with a Republican mother who were not taught any critical social justice. They lean 61-18 towards the Republicans. But if you have a Republican mother and you were exposed to the full set of critical social justice concepts, split, roughly even between Republicans and Democrats. So this does seem to be an important factor. School socialization seems to be an important factor. University matters a lot less. We have a number of studies that show people's views don't change that much between when they set foot on campus and leave. However, it is still the case that even something as simple as reading a paragraph of text in support of free speech or in support of social justice can shift views amongst college students. Now, this is in Britain. I tried this in the US and didn't get much results. So it may be that views are actually much more fixed amongst American students by the time they set foot on campus. But in Britain, if we take undergraduates, I had one third of this survey read a paragraph talking about the importance of free speech. The result was that 63% of that sample that had read that pro-free speech paragraph came out in favor of free speech as being more important than social justice. Those who read a speech harm paragraph, 48% came out in favor of emotional safety being more important than free speech. 41% for the free speech. What this showed was a significant effect, therefore, of reading a paragraph. And so their views are still somewhat malleable, even amongst undergrads. I'd say that's probably less true here than it is in Britain. So amongst young people, views still can be shifted. I think that becomes less the case as people get older. Now, I just want to finish off by trying to talk about some counter-evidence to my theory. So what I've talked a lot about is the fact young people are more woke than old, and that with generational turnover, this is going to move society in the direction of social justice or woke values, i.e. equal outcomes and emotional harm protection being more important than freedom of speech. But there are some countercurrents, and those currents have emerged. Some of them have only emerged recently. I just want to talk about some of this evidence. This is coming from Canada. One of the things we're seeing in the Canadian election is that young Canadians are as or more conservative than older Canadians in their voting habits. And this has never been seen before in the Canadian data. So what is going on there? In the New York Times a few days ago, or maybe a week ago, David Shore had a piece, and he essentially has done very intensive survey work. He works for the Democrats, and he says basically that if you take young Americans, those under age 26, white men, white women, and men of color all supported Trump more than Harris. Again, this is quite interesting data, and he's done millions of interviews. Or millions of data points. So this is quite substantial evidence that something's going on, particularly very recently. What is that, and how can that be squared with some of the evidence I showed you earlier? Okay, so I took a look at the Higher Education Research Institute data on freshman students, which is a sample of about 100,000 a year, really massive. It's been going since 1970. One of the questions there, they don't have many questions that are pertinent to what we're talking about, but one of the questions they've been asking consistently since 1970 is where you stand on the liberal-conservative political belief axis. In 1970, over 40% of men identified as liberal. A smaller share of women identified as liberal. So men were more liberal than women in 1970 and in 1980. It's only as we get into the 90s that women become, or female freshman students measured at age 18 or thereabouts, become slightly more conservative, women become slightly more liberal than men in the 90s and 2000s, but the gap's pretty modest. There's very little there. It's not really till we get really into the recent period the gender gap emerges. Roughly around 2013, 14, it reaches maybe 10 points. And by the time we get to 2020, 2021, summer of George Floyd, the peak of the Great Awakening, it's 25 points, this massive gap. But if we go past 2021, you can see these lines starting to go down. And that's indicating that the share of freshmen that identify as liberal is dropping. And it's dropped quite substantially. If we take female students, female freshman students, it's gone from pushing 60% to 45%. It's gone down almost 15 points. The share of freshman female students that identify as liberal has dropped substantially. Share of male freshman students that identify as liberal has also gone down, not quite as much, but it's gone down. So something looks to be shifting. Here's some data from Britain. Sorry, it's a bit grainy. The question here is, do you think public spaces should have separate toilets for men and women or gender-neutral toilets? Since August 22, the share of 18 to 24-year-old British people who say that we should have separate toilets for men and women, not gender-neutral toilets, has gone from 20% to 47%. It seems to have risen. There's always going to be a certain amount of noise in the data, but it seems to have gone up from 20 to 47%, more than doubled. The share of young people who are opposed to gender-neutral toilets, who want to see separate toilets for men and women. We've seen that pattern also on the immigration question amongst young British people. They've become a lot more conservative. So just in the last 2 years, we've seen something happening amongst younger people in a number of countries. I would argue that what that represents is people who were sort of in the middle and didn't have strong views have moved to the right, if you like, on some of these questions. And in fact, if you look closely at some of this survey data, there is a larger spread of views amongst young people on culture wars questions than among older people. So they are more polarized on these questions than old people. I do not think this means that woke is dead. It just means there is now a growing anti-woke faction among young people as well as a woke faction, which portends polarization. I'm really getting towards the end here. I just want to talk a little bit about this idea of a vibe shift away from woke in the culture as a whole. It is the case that sometimes attitude change can happen from the very top of society. So elites in the US went from being very open borders on immigration in the mid to late 19th century to being quite restrictionist, including progressive elites. They became convinced that immigration was a significant problem in American society. And so between the late 1880s and the early 1910s, American intellectual and cultural elites became much more restrictionist. And sometimes you get these shifts. Prohibition was popular amongst elites and lost popularity in the 1910s and 20s. And are we seeing some kind of an elite values shift occurring now? If you read the work of a number of people like Matthew Iglesias, their argument is that woke has lost intellectual energy, both at the activist level and also in terms of its influence amongst elites. And we can see this perhaps in the weaker resistance to Trump in 2024 as compared to 2016 in terms of marches and protests. It seems to have a lower volume, a lower amplitude. There doesn't seem to be the same energy. There has been a decreased use of pronouns on Twitter, actually. Even AOC no longer has pronouns in her bio. So there does seem to be something going on at the elite level of society. We also have seen op-eds in the New York Times, for example, in favor of free speech, in the Washington Post against mandatory diversity statements. We've seen a number of writers like Iglesias and Ezra Klein and Noah Smith and others critical of some aspects of this culture, or even quite critical of woke as a whole. DEI and ESG, environmental and social governance, are in retreat in corporate America. We've seen more criticism of identity politics, not only after October 7th, but after the election of Trump. So something could occur. I mentioned this phenomenon of American elites becoming more restrictionist on immigration in the 1890s. It's not impossible that we could get some kind of a shift coming in from the very top of society. And that would arguably wipe out a lot of that generational turnover in the direction of woke that I talked about earlier in the talk. So I'm not saying this is impossible. I'm saying that the generational dynamics are likely to push society in the direction of being less supportive of free speech and more oriented towards social justice. However, it is not impossible that a major shift in society's mores could occur that could wipe out that cohort change. So just to finish up here, I've argued in this talk that one of the reasons I don't think woke is going to die is because young people are more woke and less inclined to support free speech. Sexual orientation, there's been a big increase in terms of non-heterosexual orientation, and sex in terms of male-female are important correlates of support for free speech. Race and mental illness status do not, in my view, make much difference to support for free speech. I've argued that changes within the left. It's not that young people are more left-wing, it's that the meaning of being on the left has changed. It's much more oriented around identity. It doesn't value free speech as much as older leftists valued free speech. There is a youth gender gap that has emerged, which I would argue is rooted in cultural attitudes, and particularly culture war attitudes, even though there is some very recent evidence that gender gap is shrinking a little bit. So I've sort of argued that one of the reasons is that I don't think woke is dead is because cohort change. Again, older generations that are more free speech oriented dying out, younger generations that are less free speech oriented replacing them in the population. However, I've also acknowledged some important counter evidence that young people have shifted to the right in the past couple of years in a number of societies. This leads me to expect that we are likely to see growing polarization on cultural issues in the emerging generation, and this could be important for electoral politics in the future. I've also talked about the elite vibe shift, if you like, in a conservative direction, or at least in a less woke direction, and this is an important factor that could also be a wild card that might wipe out a lot of that generational turnover and shifts that are coming through cohort change. So with that, I'll finish, and I look forward to your questions.
Excellent. That was an extremely informative and data-rich talk. I go to a lot of these talks, and I would say that is in the absolute top percentile in terms of things that you actually learn. All right, so we'll open it up for questions. Yeah.
Have you done anything to control for the possibility that? Have you done anything to control for the possibility that certain age groups over time have certain characteristics, so that perhaps young people 30 years ago exhibited characteristics like those now? If that were the case, that might suggest that today's young people are just going to become old people, not carry their views forward into the future.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely a critical question, isn't it? Is this a life cycle effect, or is it generational? So I've kind of made the argument, or I'm suggesting that it's generational. What evidence do we have? Okay, so there were a few pieces of evidence. I mean, one was a study of Smith College. Now, I know Smith College is an odd place, but there was a survey done in 2000 of Smith College students saying, is it more important for people to be able to express their views, even if they are offensive? So it is important. Do you agree with this statement? It's important to be able to express their views, even if they offend some people. In 2000, people aged 18 to 22 at Smith College, 75% said yes, they should be allowed to express those views. 2016, the same question was asked to Smith College students, and it was down to 50%. So it's the same age, same question, and it's dropped substantially. The other evidence is from the General Social Survey, which goes back to 1972, and Chong, Citrin, and Levy in their paper have kind of done some of this analysis, and their argument is that even if you control for age, there's a substantial generational effect that particularly the younger generations are less tolerant of that question of a racist speaking in public. That's simply, this is something that they're less tolerant of. They do a number of other questions where they take a question that was asked in the past, they replicate that in the present, and they show a similar effect controlling for age. So I think it is, I guess I would argue, I think it is generational in nature and not just an age question.
I think I saw him in the back. Or was there one? Oh, well, Professor George.
Thanks. A couple of things, Professor Kaufmann. First, you mentioned right at the end that the gender gap seems to be narrowing according to some very recent data. Do those data show that it's narrowing because girls are moving a bit rightward or boys are moving a bit leftward, or is it some of each? That's my first question, and then I have another one.
Okay. Yeah, I think, so the two data points, this is very new. So David Shor's work on the 2024 election is one element of that, showing that white women under age 26 were more for Trump than for Harris. And that's quite astounding given, that is quite surprising. Now, if you look at his data, you can see that white women, say 30 to 40, were more Harris inclined, and white women under 25 were more Trump inclined. And so, again, this is very recent, and so there's all kinds of caveats next to that. But it would be young women moving right would be the reason for it. And also in that HERI data, you could see that women were a lot more liberal than, or young women, freshmen were more liberal than young male freshmen. But in the last few years, because of that decline in young women being liberal, it's like 15-point decline. They've moved away from liberalism 15 points. So that's the reason that you're seeing some shrinkage there.
Thank you. And my second question has to do with the question of what, if any, relation is there between that and developments in religious belief and practice. For the first time in my lifetime, I think for the first time since data have been collected, there seemed to be, especially in the younger generation, it seems to be the case that boys are more religiously observant, go to church and synagogue and so forth more often than girls, or young men more than young women. That is really new, if that's in fact true. Is there some relationship between the changes in religious practice and the political changes? And when it comes to the vibe shift, does any of that have to do with religion? I mean, one of the most interesting things that I'm feeling in the vibe is the virtual collapse of the once charging forward new atheism. And some of the leading new atheists have declared they're no longer atheists. And some of those who remain atheists say they're cultural Christians. Right. And what's that all about? What's going on there?
That's a really good question. I mean, we've known for a while, Robert Putnam's book, American Grace, showing that political views and religion, certainly religious affiliation, are connected. So if you are conservative, you're probably more likely to say you attend and that you identify as Christian. And if you are liberal, you are, if anything, likely to understate your religion. So there are a whole bunch of connections here, and I absolutely think they're connected. Yes, and I think so. For example, the gender gap, which has opened up since the early 2010s. Generally speaking, the orthodoxy has been that women are more religious than men in Abrahamic societies. I mean, one of the reasons that has changed, I would argue, is because of this emerging gender gap, men being more conservative, women being more liberal. And there's a correlation between your political beliefs and having religious affiliation. And once you identify as Christian, you're probably somewhat more likely to attend as well. So these things do affect each other. So I think that's very much bound up with political shifts. Now, one of the things that's going to be really an interesting test of that is if young women are moving to the right or becoming less liberal, are we going to see their religiosity rise in these surveys? And that would be the prediction. I mean, if this is going to continue. So,
do you have any speculation about cause and effect?
Well, okay. I mean, one of the things we know is, just in terms of answering survey questions, which is how a lot of this work is done. Again, if you are conservative, you might be more likely to identify as Christian rather than no religion, and more likely to say you attend, even if you don't necessarily, or if you attend very irregularly. And in fact, there have been some people who've done studies where they've gone into church parking lots and tried to count cars and things to make the argument that church attendance is kind of lower in conservative areas than it's expressed. But in any case, I think there is an identity dimension to this. I mean, Putnam very much made that case, even switching denominations to match your political beliefs, leaving the Episcopalians, for example, if you're conservative. So I do think part of this is how people are answering survey questions, but not only. I don't think that's the only factor. One of the things is also that if you are religious, you're more likely to be Republican and conservative. I mean, that's another pathway. But I think in this case, if we're talking about changes over time and recent changes, I think it's more likely to be the case that the ideology is moving first. So the political beliefs are shifting, and that's what's shifting the religious affiliation and attendance. If I were to speculate, that's how I would see the relationship.
Yes, here in the back. They'll bring you a microphone. So.
Yeah, data by definition has variables. And one of the big questions, I don't know if it's covered at all, is what news media are they watching and how it impacts the overall results of the surveys?
Yeah, I mean, those news media questions are difficult. The question is always, are they watching MSNBC because they're liberal, or are they liberal because they're watching an MSNBC? It's very hard to kind of figure out what's the chicken and what's the egg there, unless you have. There was a study done where they looked at the laying of cable. I mean, some of you may have heard that Fox News was bundled in with cable that was laid in different places, so you could sort of look at, people now got cable, so they got Fox, and in fact they did show a little bit of a shift towards the Republicans. But yeah, I mean, we know there's obviously a strong correlation. How the media effects, I'm trying to think of what I've seen in that area that's convincing to me, that can prove that it's going from media to political beliefs. One other thing, so for example, if you look at the Great Awakening, the rise of people saying that, racism is one of the biggest problems facing America today, or white supremacy is an issue. Zach Goldberg's done work on this showing that, as we get into the 2010s, people who are moving into the new media, BuzzFeed and Vox, and are more on social media and getting their opinions from Twitter, which at the time was very much leaning to the left, that seemed to be correlated with sort of people saying that racism was a big problem in America. So it did seem to be that exposure to the new media, the new social media, did seem to sort of have some causal power in explaining why we were seeing this Great Awakening, and why people were saying that racism was such an enormous problem in America when they hadn't been saying that in previous decades. So yeah, the media is playing a part. I mean, it's all a bit confusing now, because there's been a kind of anti-woke backlash as well. Since the anti-woke backlash, if we look at sort of big data analysis, was about 4 years after the sort of takeoff in these social justice terms like unconscious bias and transphobia and all of these other things, which take off in 2015, let's say. It's only 2019 that we see a lot of the anti-woke terms starting to rise, and so this backlash is now also happening in the media, and so both of these things are occurring, and it's very difficult for me now, as of today, to say what's causing what. I think, however, a strong case Goldberg made, I think, a pretty strong case that the rise of the new media and social media was important for the emergence of the Great Awakening. So that part of it, I think, is convincing. The vibe shift now and the decline of those terms if you look at New York Times and Washington Post, we're not seeing the use of the term white supremacy as often. We're not seeing the use of the term patriarchy. And some of these, sexism, racism, a lot of those terms have dropped in frequency. What's behind that? And this is a question, right? And how much is the fact that the New York Times is less interested in that stuff going to lead to a shift? Or does that explain some of the shift in young people's attitudes that we saw? Possibly, yeah.
I'm going to abuse the chair's privilege and ask some questions. I had many, but maybe just a couple. I mean, one thing that I thought was especially useful was as an alternative to the idea of woke dying out, the notion that woke will persist, but an anti-woke reaction will rise alongside of it. And so we'll just get polarization. I think that's an important intervention to make into the discourse. But actually, I just want to ask two questions, maybe. One is about specific policy matter that you touched on only at the end, which is about immigration. And my own sense of to kind of divine the vibe shift, like Professor George did a moment ago. My own sense is that immigration is the driving force in America, to a large degree, of the backlash against progressive excess, or whatever you want to call it. And I just wonder if you agree with that. Certainly, Trump himself seems to believe that is the issue that won him the election, and the new right, such as it is, seems to view that as the central kind of tool in its arsenal against woke. And I just wonder what you think about that specifically. And then a more general question about the prospects for free speech, which you talked about a lot. I mean, one thing that we could say, right, is that if you just look historically, free speech is always unpopular. Right. Very few societies honor anything close to an ideal of free speech. And indeed, the rationales about, harm and feelings and protection of sensibilities have been there too. Those aren't a recent innovation. That's why Mill writes on liberty specifically to push back against those kinds of arguments, which he saw as, rightly as being very prevalent and were indeed invoked by a lot of English judges in the 19th century. You can't defend the sensitivities of Christians, right? It seems like what's interesting about woke is not that it's against free speech. It's that the sensitivities it's concerned about are those of minorities and not the majority. And, which is, of course, what Mill assumes is going to be the threat to free speech. And if you just look generally, historically, it tended to be the majorities, prevailing religious beliefs or mores or what have you, that were protected by restrictions on speech. And so I guess the question is just, is a period of free speech, we're going to look back and say, maybe that was just a fortuitous historical blip, and in a sense we will return to the historical norm of being against free speech, but the rationale for it is kind of inverted. The relative moral force of the majority and minorities has been kind of flipped in the calculus for why it is that people are against free speech. So any thoughts you have on those two questions would be great.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I'd never actually thought of I've not focused on that actually, but that there has been the shift. But I'll just deal with the first question first, which is the immigration. I talked a lot about this in my book, Whiteshift, which is more explaining the rise of populism. I think immigration for the United States and for the American voters in 2024, particularly for Republicans, was a very high salience issue. That's true. Now, it's also true, by the way, in Europe. By far and away, the absolute number one correlate of whether you vote for the AfD, the Sweden Democrats, the British Reform Party, is how important you think immigration is as an issue. So was that central to Trump's victory? Absolutely, yeah. I think it was. Now, the question of what is its relationship to the culture war. And so the way that I think about this, I actually think immigration is in many ways a separate issue. In some ways, it's a separate issue from culture war issues around speech boundaries, around dishonoring historical figures, renaming people, renaming buildings and knocking down statues. But there is a connection in the sense that speech restrictions actually, I think, created the market for right-wing populism. So if you imagine, I'll just take an example, which is the case of Sweden. And I can also take the US as an example, but in Sweden, in 2014, the mainstream Conservative Party said we have to have a discussion about immigration levels to Sweden. He was attacked, the interior minister was attacked in the press as a racist, quickly backed away from that. Within a year, the Sweden Democrats had come out of nowhere and were on 12.5%, and eventually reached 25%. And so essentially, to the extent that woke, again, which means equal outcomes and emotional harm protection for racial, gender, and minority groups, to the extent that that's a dominant value, it limits free speech. So it would say, we can't talk about immigration, which is about non-white people coming to a mainly white country, because that's racism. And because of that restriction, the mainstream parties were not able to have this debate, and therefore the only people who could touch this were people who were willing to violate the taboos, which is the Sweden Democrats. And so without the kind of woke, quote-unquote, speech restrictions, you wouldn't have had a market for populists. So that's the sort of way I see that relationship, is actually that woke leads to right-wing populism by limiting debate and pushing that debate beyond the bounds where the populists. Similarly for Trump, he was the only one of 17 primary candidates to run explicitly on the border and immigration, to make that a centerpiece of his campaign. The others wouldn't go there because of speech restrictions. So I think that, again, we're seeing similar kind of dynamic. But again, I think immigration I still think it's functionally separate from these issues like trans, critical race theory, etc., teaching of history. I think they're separate issues. Immigration has a much higher salience, but the culture war issues occasionally become more important and can matter for elections. The second question, there's always been these restrictions. What I would say, however, is you saw in that GSS data, the U.S. societies, and Western societies as a whole, were becoming more tolerant of offensive speech through the 20th century. And that only starts to change as we sort of near later in the century. And you're right, that's a change from majoritarian sensibilities to minoritarian sensibilities. And that's kind of interesting. I guess you could almost say, like at one time when offending the king, right, offending a very elite minority, that was what got you in trouble. Then it was offending the sensibilities of the masses. And now it's, minority group sensibilities. And of course, those minority group sensibilities matter mainly because there is a powerful and significant progressive group for whom those minorities are important symbolic totems. And so it's actually a larger group than just the minorities. It's actually, a quite large and influential group. Yeah.
But you have sort of les majesté, les majorité, les minorité, something like that as the periodization. Great. I think Madeline and then here. And that will probably have to end at that point.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. So I just wanted to return to the gender question. Because you showed that women are more likely to be in favor of cancel culture across the political spectrum, if I read that right. And at the same time, when this all began in the 70s, it seemed like men were more likely to be liberal and a bit more radical. So I'm wondering, is there something about cancel culture that women tend to be more drawn to in itself? Or are women just more likely to maintain the status quo once it's already established? Like with religion, for example, they used to be more likely to enforce religious views. So has cancel culture, in effect, become the kind of new religion? And is that why women tend to support it more? Or is there something that women feel is more important about it?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important question, and there are many different views on this. This whole kind of feminization thesis, as institutions become more female, are they going to become more woke? Does this explain the Great Awakening? And I'm not as convinced of that thesis as some other people. We can ask a simple question: why weren't convents woke? Right? I mean, if you take an institution that was run by women in a previous era, right? Just having more women didn't necessarily make them more touchy-feely and support, historically marginalized groups of whatever kind. So there has to be something else here, and I think there's some change in the culture. I would agree with a couple of, those who take the evolutionary psychology view, I would agree with some things. One is that women are more interested in protection and are going to be less free speech and more protection oriented. I think that's probably going to be true. It might have been the case in the past that women were more concerned about religious and patriotic mores not being violated. And that's why they were less free speech. And maybe now, so they may have been against free speech because they were more conservative. Now they're more liberal and they're more against free speech. But the common piece is that they are more against free speech. And I think that's probably something that is to do with evolutionary psychology, upholding the established prestigious communal value system, whether that's a religious one, whether that's a woke one. I think that's probably, if I had to put money on it, I think that's what's going on. The idea of women being more liberal than men, I wouldn't put money on that holding, because it's changed over time. And it just depends what the prestigious established values are. That's sort of the way I would theorize it. Yeah.
Great. And maybe a last question here.
Thanks so much. Love your works and your work at the Heterodox Academy, etc. I'd like to serve up an alternative definition of woke, and I think it's one that Russ Douthat of the New York Times wrote a couple of years ago, which I think is pretty good, and I encourage everybody to go look at it. And it's called "What is Woke?" And it's a little different from yours, and it explains why woke is so illiberal. And what essentially, if I could sort of paraphrase what he said, is that when you are awakened to the truth of the power structures of humanity, you will see how the constructs of masculinity, femininity are just constructs, and this has all been pressed down upon us. And the only way to break through that is to indeed smash those institutional structures. And I thought that was a good, for me, it was kind of understanding as why also gender ideology was so important and at the forefront for the woke. And indeed, part of that is, gender is a construct. And when in fact, gender is just a fluid, choice.
Right.
Okay, so these contracts need to be smashed, okay? And that's a little bit different from yours, saying that sort of a sacralizing of historical marginalizing groups, et cetera. And you can sort of see why it's in there. So I'd like to react to that. And I have one almost entirely separate comment, though, is I personally believe woke is alive, well, and kicking, and stronger than ever, especially as I live in a blue state and in a blue township, where I'm seeing the stranglehold on DEI funding and the groupthink, sort of, and the teachers' associations. Is I literally don't see any change in what's being taught. None. If anything, it's getting stronger, and it's the same limited pool of educators that are going to the same, whatever academies and structures, reading the same media, and it's all just self-reinforcing. I just don't see much changing. So love to hear your comment on that.
Yeah. Two really rich questions there. So on the first one, so this question of the blank slate and all these things being social constructs, and we have to smash those social constructs and whatever is constructing male, female, or what, etc. I think the reason that I don't think that is as, certainly that's going on, but the reason I don't think that's as integral a woke is because you can see situations where woke really aren't very social constructionist at all. So, is being gay something that you just kind of construct and deconstruct? Oh no, that's something you're born with, right? So they're not, or can you change race? Suddenly, well, actually, no. This is not something you're allowed to do. You can change sex, but you can't change race. So they're very selective in when they want to apply the blank slate and when they want to say you're born this way. So I don't think that's as central to the definition. That would be my view. Second point, which was really, the second question was really interesting because, I completely agree with you. And another case that we could look at is the fact that outside the U.S., you've had Trump taking on DEI, you've had DeSantis, and you've had a lot of state-level action against critical race and gender ideology. But if you leave the U.S., you go to Canada, for example, you go to Britain, woke is completely in the driver's seat. There's almost no push. There's a little bit of pushback on the trans stuff in Britain, but not on the DEI at all. And Canada, of course, is completely out of control on this stuff. A little bit of tiny pushback in some provinces, but only at the edges of the trans stuff, but nothing touching on the indigenous crazy, the mass gray, all these kinds of things. None of that is actually being dealt with at all. There was one British Columbia MLA who did say, look, no bodies have been found, there's no mass grave, and she was forced out of the Conservative Party. That's kind of where Canada is. So unless there is strong pressure coming from the executive, there's not going to be any change. And there's going to be a lot of resistance. So I think there's going to be resistance wherever they can. They will shapeshift, they will sort of try and hide, they will kind of, they're not going to want to give it up. And so I think this is where, you saw when I was talking about the three awakenings, this consolidation, I think the bush has been trimmed back, but it's ready to sort of come out again because it's been institutionalized in HR departments. And yes, some companies are cutting back on it. I'm not convinced it's going to completely go away. There's just too many people who truly believe in this. And so I think your experience is going to continue. This is going to be a theme that will continue in politics. But I think just because there's some executive orders, even if there's some enforcement, I don't think that means it's gone away. No.
Great. Let's thank Professor Kaufmann for a great talk.